I was reflecting on the fact that it's just over a year since I gave a seminar here at CMR, and it's quite a lot changed in the past year. It seems like more than a year, I think, has gone by, and certainly I noticed the CMR have been particularly busy on various issues, not least the situation that arose in the Ukraine from just at the time that I visited it a year ago. My research journey over the past year has been a little bit quieter. It's been a bit more reflective, and that's what I want to focus in on today. I want to reflect a bit on, well, as the title says, Precarious Evidence on Precarious Labour, ? Looking at and beyond employee stories of work, employment and migration. It was inspired by, well, it has been inspired by a referee's comment on a journal article, which was, a little bit, shall we say, sceptical about the value of the employer perspective, and particularly a reliance on the employer perspective in social research. But it should hopefully come as no surprise that I don't think that employer evidence is precarious. What I think we need to do is reflect some more on the nature of employer evidence and on this kind of way in which it's situated in a particular context and emerges out of a form of elite interviewing that involves the employers often seeking to give a particular front of stage performance and impression manage the perspective that we have of them, or that we gain from them over the course of in-depth interviewing and other forms of research with employers. So that's what I want to reflect on today. And you're kind of getting two for the price of one today, because Sarah and I were chatting about the presentation and the paper that we're writing linked to the presentation, and we're now going to, I think, cut it into two papers. So I'm going to give both of those today in 45 minutes, hopefully in 45 minutes, but you're kind of getting two for the price of one, so it's bargain corner today. So as a geographer, I'm going to start with a map, and I should perhaps actually move this because I noticed it's coming up on the screen. And why am I starting with a map? Well, naturally, a geographer needs to include a map in a presentation, but also maps are very useful in terms of showing a particular way in which the world is represented, in a particular way in which, leading to a particular way in which we see the world. And this is the Mercator projection, and just to put it into context, Greenland can fit inside Africa 14 times, inside China 4 times, but this is the projection, this is the view we're given of the world. And very much the presentation today is around the view that we're given, and it's not arguing that there's a truth or there's a falsehood out there to be exposed, but there's a complex reality, and there's in fact multiple truths to appreciate when you're engaged in research, and particularly when you're engaged in employer research. So there's different ways of the world being represented to us, and we need to reflect on that, and we need to have a critical awareness about that. So I'm going to spend part of the presentation reflecting on methodologically, and part actually presenting some evidence of the way in which employers construct the world. So the first part will be a bit of a methodological reflection. The second part will be what is it that the employers are actually telling us. And it draws largely on research that I've done since about 2008 on the employer perspective in terms of labour migration. So that's what I'm going to focus in on today. And there's, I guess, a number of areas I want to look at. I want to first of all demonstrate the importance of low-wage labour migration to higher income economies, and particularly to the precarious labour markets. I want to argue that the employer perspective has been relatively neglected until recently, that is. E-Factor, a really important project in that respect, but even with various recent moves to look at the employer perspective, there's still an absence of methodological reflection on the employer angle and what it offers us. So there's still a bit of neglect there in a particular area of literature. And I'm going to show that employers are quite consistent can be quite consistent in terms of getting in role and presenting presenting migration in a particular way. There are some concerns over legitimacy of the employer perspective. I certainly have had that through in at least one reviewer's comments. But I'm going to argue it's not about precarious evidence, it's just about the situatedness of that evidence and reflecting on that and reflecting where it comes from and what are the limits of the evidence that we're being presented with. I want to draw on the concept of impression management and the way in which employers in many ways seek to impression manage the interview situation. And do I press OK to that? My Polish isn't good enough to...
yeah, just press OK.
Yeah, I was hoping you didn't say restart the computer or something like that. And with an eye on front of stage performance, there's sometimes a bit of an artificial dichotomy, I think, between front stage and backstage, but for the purposes of the presentation, I'm going to talk about front of stage performance from employers and the way in which they seek to impression manage, and it draws on, in some respects, on, well, the terminology draws on Goffman's work and presentation of self, but it's looking beyond that as well, really. So start with a bit of a context, a bit of a rationale. Migration is increasing. The number of the proportion of migrants who are international labour migrants is incredibly significant. It's the most significant tranche of the migration numbers, of the migration flows, and most of it's concerned with high income economies, particularly Europe, North America, and certain Gulf states as well. So that's where we are in terms of the context and the rationale at a global level. In relation to the UK, which is where most of my research has been, we've had for at least a couple of decades now, we've had this consensus between unions, between business and between government that migration is in the national interest, particularly labour migration, and we need to recognise the positive contribution. Now that goes alongside other negative commentaries and manoeuvrings around migration that tend to focus on illegals and asylum seekers, refugees. There's a whole host of kind of negative attention around that, but we've had an economic realisation for at least 2 decades now that labour migration, it's known that labour migration is a key part of the economic success success until recently of the UK economy. And if we can see that in terms of, I'm not sure how easy that is to see, but if you look at the graph on the right and you look at foreign-born populations, you can see the rise from just under 10% to just over 18% from 2004 to 2021 in terms of the proportion of the labour force that is non-UK born. So there's a clear, whatever we see in terms of political rhetoric, and that often focuses on the negative, there's a clear acknowledgement and knowledge that there's a strong kind of economic driver behind migration and that the UK economy has been reliant on labour migration of late. So there's a rationale for looking at the employer perspective, I think, in that context. And I'm particularly interested in horticulture. 99%, it's estimated, of seasonal workers come from overseas, from outside of the UK. Even in COVID-19 times, that figure was probably pretty accurate, although there were some locally based workers who came into the horticultural labour market. And we've had a shift of nationalities in horticulture from A8 migrants, through to A2 Bulgarian and Romanian migrants, through to Ukrainian, through to, as you'll see in the column on the right here, through to a whole range of different horticultural workers now under the new guest worker visa. So we've had this shift, but nonetheless the dominance of an employer demand for migrant labour, to the extent that the most recent year of the horticultural workers scheme, the numbers are now up to the cap on the number of guest workers is now at 45,000. On the old scheme that was abolished after EU enlargement, that was in the 20s of thousands rather than 45,000. So it's more or less doubled, the visa scheme. So there's an expansion, or at least an expansion in theory. We don't know yet whether that 45,000 cap is going to be reached. There's an expansion in theory of the guest worker scheme. So there's clearly strong evidence of employer lobbying there, strong employer voice, and strong need for migrant workers. So that's, if you like, the rationale behind the focus, a particular demand for migrant labour in certain low-wage sectors, especially horticulture, and I'm going to talk about that horticultural sector in the UK context. Before I do, I wanted to just situate the studies that have been done on the employer perspective. A classic study for anyone interested in following up the employer perspective, a classic studies Walding and Lichter from 2003. And just shortly after that, Néstor Rodriguez said that studies on foreign migrant workers usually have given scant attention to employers. I'd argue the situation's changed, if not significantly, a fair bit since then. But certainly we've not had much reflection on the employer perspective, and that's where this presentation comes in. There are a few articles out there that reflect on the accounts that employers give. This is from us. The first of the accounts that are identified. There may be more, so if any of you know of more, then I'd love to hear about them, because I couldn't find many recent studies when I was looking that actually reflected on the evidence that employers had given. And this one from Australia reflecting on discrimination towards refugees by employers, focused on the fact that employers generally engaged in cautious impression management, providing the sort of information they perceived we wanted, or saying little that would challenge their own positive self-image. So an idea of impression management creeps into this particular study, and that's what I want to pull out. That's the idea I want to pull out in relation to how employers present information to us. Another study, Landesmarki and Sutari, looked at the rural context, the specific rural context of employers and engaging with and employing migrant labour, and argued that particularly in rural contexts there was an eye on legitimacy surrounding their employment of migrant labour, and that they talked about migration with the aim of establishing legitimacy in the local community. And that was particularly strong in rural areas which tended to be tight and knit, and where people tended to know other people more intimately. So a couple of studies there. Campbell from Australia goes beyond the idea of impression management to actually think about the way in which, in some contexts, employers actually kind of may exaggerate and may make overblown claims of labour shortages, for example, in order to generate more generous guest worker systems in the Australian context. So Campbell concludes that there's little evidence to support claims of labour shortages, despite employers claiming that to a significant degree. And as a result, dubious policy initiatives actually emerge. So that's a bit more extreme than the College Pisco and Tilbury piece from Australia. A bit more extreme than the two pieces that I looked at. Arguing that there's an active kind of employers are going out of their way to actively misinform, essentially, to gain policy outcomes. Whereas Tilbury and College Pisco and Landesmarki and Sutari, they're more focused on impression management, on the way in which employers seek to kind of develop a positive impression amongst the wider public and amongst policymakers. So we've got a bit of a continuum, if you like, of studies from kind of impression management through to active exaggeration and misinformation. So there's some examples of research that does reflect on the employer perspective. I wouldn't say in an extensive and a detailed way, but there's certainly some reflection on the employer perspective. And I want to offer my own reflections on the employer perspective before focusing in on some the actual evidence that employers give. So there's two parts to the remainder of the presentation. One is the methodological part, reflections on that. The second one is focusing on what employers actually say. So in terms of evidence, there's quite a lot of evidence that I'm drawing on for this. You'll notice a kind of, to start with, in the early research, 2007, 2008 that I did, the number of employers that I managed to get, and we managed to get, because sometimes it was with others, involved in the research was pretty high. As we go to more recent periods of time, we've been a bit less ambitious in the number of employer responses. There has been an issue, I think, in the UK, and I'm not sure whether it's true, it may be true in Poland as well, I don't know, and I'd welcome kind of views on this. There has been an issue of access, I think, over recent years, to do with some of the fatigue associated with a lot of researchers entering the terrain of particularly of horticultural migrant labour. So there has been a bit of a fatigue, if you like, and so access has become more of an issue with more and more, with employers being less open, I think, to research, and in some cases actually charging, if it's a survey, actually charging money to complete the survey. I've heard of that happening in horticulture. But I'm especially interested not necessarily in the access issue, though that is an issue, and I think that's an increasing issue in terms of employer research. I'm interested more in the disclosure issue and what employers are willing to say and how they're willing to say it, and also what they don't say. It's not only about what's said, it's about what's left unsaid and left off the table in the interview, and that's what I'm interested in today. So I've noted this access is hard over time. The third bullet point there is really around the fact that when you do look at the elite interviewing literature, and I guess employer interviews are a kind of form of elite interview, there tends to be a lot of discussion around positionality in the elite interview and the position of the researcher and the person being researched, and possibly how you bridge gaps between the two in the elite interview, or how you may act up, for example, in the elite interview. There's a lot of positionality, but much less on other areas of the elite interview that I think are equally and arguably more important to focus in on. So where the methodology literature is strong, I think it's on reflections around positionality in elite interviewing, and where it's weaker is on kind of certain issues associated with disclosure. Key characteristics of the employer interview and elite interviewing in general. You've obviously got time pressures. It's when you're going out and interviewing employers, there are usually, I recall one interview in particular where the person his phone was constantly going because there were various other pressures on time, and he kept having to cut out and get back into the interview because time was money and time was of the essence. So time pressures are really always in the background in terms of employer interviews. In elite interviews and employer interviews, there's a particularly knowledgeable person you're trying to tap, but they're perhaps likely to want to control the interview dynamic, and a lot has been said about that in reflecting on issues around positionality and things associated with those. So elite interviewees are much more likely to want to control the narrative. There's reputational issues to think about, given the status of employers. And the employers may well have experience of lobbying, may well have experience of engaging with government, may well have experience of generally kind of being public facing. So they're all things that come into play in elite interviews and in employer interviews, which are a form of elite interviewing. As I said, in bold here, the positionality in the elite interview focused on more often than not. But there are another set of issues that are important to think about, particularly in relation to horticulture, there's the issue of the expose. I'll put an example of one that's just come out in the past week in the UK up there, but there's the fear of engaging with a researcher, and that researcher then exposing potentially poor labour conditions, for example. There's the fear of upsetting the existing status quo, particularly around supermarkets and particularly around smaller companies feeding up to larger companies and upsetting business relationships. There's the desire to try and influence the legal and policy terrain, and we've seen that in the UK, massively really, especially amongst horticultural employers wanting to influence legislation and policy, particularly around the guest worker visa. And also the role of the particular employer, or the particular person you speak to within the company as employer, because employer is a variegated, heterogeneous category, and that can be important as well. Do you speak to the HR manager? Do you speak to the farmer? Do you speak to the managing director? Who do you speak to within the particular organisation? So all those kind of things are really important in kind of understanding the fact that the knowledge we get through the employer interview is very much kind of a situated form of knowledge and very much contingent upon a number of factors operating at the same time. Nonetheless, there are common narratives that come out of employer interviews, particularly with horticultural employers, which is the focus of this presentation. As I've said, as a way of kind of conceptualising the employer research with employers, in particular the employer interview, but not just employer interviews, it may come through, for example, in survey responses as well, is the idea that employers are presenting a particular front of stage and engaged in performance at the front of stage, and are seeking to impression manage. And that impression management may be both conscious and subconscious. It may involve what's said, it may involve also what's left unsaid. But there are a range of ways in which employers engage with researchers and other people from outside of their immediate sphere that have an eye on a kind of public performance and impression management. Now, in relation to impression management, a lot of the literature comes from business and management, and it's about how employees within companies seek to impression manage with an eye on, say, promotion, getting ahead within an organisation. A lot of impression management literature is focused on that. I'm kind of wanting to use the concept to understand the research interaction within the employer sphere of research, within employer research. So I'm arguing basically that it's time to apply the idea of front stage performance and impression management to employer research. That's the argument that I'm seeking to make. That's the key kind of narrative that runs through the presentation, if you like, today. And in terms of impression management, I guess there's a sense in which it sits between two extremes, if you like, and one being the overly guarded kind of interview dynamic, which sometimes even if you negotiate access to an employer, they can be very guarded when you get to the interview stage and when you're interviewing them. So, recalling one particular instance, myself and a colleague sat down with a couple of people from a farm in the east of England, a place called Boston in Lincolnshire, and they were immediately on guard, and they were giving kind of one-word responses to questions. It wasn't the kind of in-depth interview that you wouldn't use it to teach students about how to carry out an in-depth interview. But that the employer was incredibly guarded, and one of them actually went, whilst we were interviewing them, went away and said they were going to check our credentials and check our research credentials whilst we were doing the interview. So someone went away and did that, which was slightly perturbing, but I didn't really have much to worry about, because I didn't think they were going to read any journal articles within the half hour or hour that we were going to be there. But nonetheless, they were incredibly guarded, and some employers are, it's curtain drawn kind of thing. Even if they agree to the interview, the curtain's drawn and you don't get much out of it. On the other extreme, you can have extremely candid, extremely open dialogue with an employer. To give you an example of this, I remember in a similar area in Lincolnshire, which is the big vegetable growing area in the UK. We went to speak to an employer who had just had a meeting with a supermarket about how they could lower their costs and how they could lower their price for their vegetables. And they were really livid, they were really kind of annoyed by this. And then we went in and had a meeting with them. And they went on and on about how unfair the system was, how no one's prepared to speak up, how it's all about the supermarkets. And it was a really kind of candid, the mask had slipped, if you like, and they were really talking about things that usually remain hidden in the employer interview. And they're the two extremes, but in the middle of that, most of the time you get, what I'd argue you get is impression management and the front of stage performance. So between the curtain being drawn and between saying completely backstage, you generally get the idea of impression management and a front of stage performance. Sometimes it's about defence. So elite interviewees, employers have a lot to lose from disclosure. So it's about being defensive and being guarded in terms of what you release to the outside world. And sometimes it's about offence rather than defence. It's about attack rather than defence. It's about trying to shape the narrative, trying to shape how things are seen, how the workplace is being viewed. Just to give a couple of examples of that, in terms of defence, this was in the news in the UK. I think it was last week, which was an expose on a number of farms about how it says here that they treat you like an animal, about how poor the conditions were on the farms in the UK, particularly linked to the seasonal worker visa. So employers are obviously concerned. They're aware of these exposes, and they're obviously quite defensive in relation to that. At the same time, they're also aware that they need to push for more workers, or not necessarily more workers, but ensure that both the quantity and quality of workers is maintained onto the farms at relatively low wages. And maintaining that quantity and quality is about an offensive pitch rather than just a defensive pitch. So in impression management, we get both the attack and also both the defence happening. So just to summarise the methodological reflections, and in its early days at this stage, it's this is a paper that Sarah and I will hopefully be working on over the coming months. Dramaturgy is important in considering the elite and employer interviews in particular. We're focused on front of stage performance, aware of course that the front backstage dichotomy doesn't always apply, but we're focused on the front stage performance, particularly the concept of impression management. The performance is both about conscious and subconscious action, and it's about silences as well as what's being said. So it's not about as the title of the talk suggests, it's not about precarious evidence. It's about just understanding the nature of the way in which the accounts from employers are constructed. I'd argue that the idea of front of stage and impression management are really key to unlocking that. Just a note on double standards, we can't really criticise it. I don't think we should be criticising employers for impression management and for presenting front of stage performance, because everyone engages in that. The researcher engages in some degree of impression management in the research encounter. So it's important that we recognise it's something that extends beyond the employer research, but is particular to employer research. That's what I'd argue. So conscious of time, so I'll probably go through this reasonably quickly. Empirically, what does impression management look like? How does it manifest itself in the accounts that employers give? Well, I've written about this quite a lot, so I won't labour the point too much, but there's a divide, in the UK at least, there's a divide between employers positioning having a strong preference for migrant workers and championing migrant workers versus quite entrenched negativity towards locally based or would-be locally based workers, so people who perhaps aren't working it but could work on farms. So I'm going to talk very briefly about that. Then talk about employers' shared understandings of why that polarisation exists, and then talk about the way in which precarious work's presented positively by employers. I think that's, to my mind, they're the main kind of narratives that come out of the employer research that I've carried out. But there are also a number of silences as well, and I'll end by silences because I think the silences are sometimes are as illuminating, and the absences are as illuminating as what's present and what's said. And that's important in terms of understanding impression management, because impression management by its nature is about what you leave behind as well as what you put on the table. In terms of preference, there are a whole host of quotes I could have used here, but the idea is that migrant workers in the UK have a much stronger work ethic, and it's not just about quantity of workers, it's finding the right quality of workers, and that's what farmers are trying to do. And this quote alludes to that really. The Eastern European people that I now employ are of much higher calibre. That's the key emphasis from that quote. So it's about presenting migration in a very positive light in that respect. To the extent that even in the height of the COVID pandemic, when employers were faced with barriers to travel, when migrants couldn't get into the UK, they were putting on charter flights to bring in seasonal workers for 6 months, and bringing people in and then essentially quarantining people on farms during the pandemic. So even at the height of the pandemic, there wasn't the desire to really try and crack the labour supply issue on farms. It was about charter flights and bringing people in. The preference is that strong and that ingrained, and it's that important economically. Then we've got prejudice. It's around British people being lazy, and the fact that there's a benefits culture that's really negative and really having an impact, and how we need to control benefits harder, we need to lower benefits, we need to make people work, all these kind of things. And this whole idea of identifying a kind of preferred workforce, but then scapegoating and othering certain segments of the British population is what comes through from this polarised series of accounts from employers as to the kind of labour that they would prefer. And the issue of negativity towards the poorest in UK society, and particularly towards people on benefits, is deep-rooted in the UK. I think it's deep-rooted in a lot of societies, but it's particularly a thing that the tabloid press bang on about. The scapegoating benefits claimants, calling them skivers and lazy, and employers kind of repeated, or a number of employers repeated those kind of ideas during the research encounter. In terms of explaining that polarisation, it wasn't necessarily about silences here, it was about degrees to which certain explanations came to the fore versus other ones that were more minor explanations. And so often it was the case that a benefits culture and a culture of laziness in the UK explained the lack of British workers. Superior skills explained the presence of migrant workers, particularly soft skills. and a recognition as well that wages go further across a dual frame of reference came through as well. To some extent, there was an acknowledgement that guest worker visas, in the early research, guest worker visas were still important. Constrained workers in some way, so made them more likely to be migrant workers, made them more likely to be more productive. Likewise, some recognition that moving individually rather than with family members meant that they were the classic Homo economicus and devoted to work on farms, and also some recognition that living on site made a difference in terms of work ethic. But mainly, it was a focus on the benefit culture, the softer skills that migrants bring, and the idea that they can invest in a life back home, and the wages go further back home. And that brings us on to the idea that precarious work is framed in a positive way, and there were two main framings of precarious work in a positive way. One was around the way in which precarious work in the UK can lead to a much more affluent lifestyle back in the home country. So this idea of a dual frame of reference, migrant workers, employers were saying, are going back, building houses and feeding families and sending money back home and buying fantastic houses with swimming pools. This is from a few years back. They're now rich in Poland. It says living like kings. So this is from a few years back, but there's a lot of this stuff came out of the way in which precarious work was framed in a positive way through the way in which it can buy certain lifestyles back home, and that's how employers framed it. They also framed it in a positive way in terms of benevolence, in terms of looking after migrant workers when they're on the farm, and putting on sports events, taking migrant workers to supermarkets, sorting doctors out for them, providing pool tables, providing internet connections, providing all those kind of things. So acting in a benevolent way, even though the employment is precarious, it's low paid, it's really tough. Work was framed in a positive way through those two tactics. One of which was around looking at consumption back home, and the other one was about employers behaving in a kind of altruistic, benevolent kind of way towards their staff. So there were two ways in which the framings of precarious work or the way in which precarious work was turned from a negative to a positive, essentially. And then we had silences. And I'm conscious of time, so this is why I'm rounding off the presentation. We had silences around the exploitative nature of precarious work. Employers aren't, obviously going to talk too much about the way in which the work is exploitative and the way in which there are major power imbalances between workers and employers. They're not going to talk about the way in which at the bottom of labour markets in higher income economies, migration is sometimes associated with a decline in paying conditions relative to either an absolute decline or relative to other forms of employment. That very rarely would they talk about corporate pressure and the supermarkets and the big companies. That was quite uncommon. Apart from, I gave one instance earlier, there weren't many instances of that. And related to all those three is the fact that kind of ideas of there being an alternative food production system where could be better, where there could be a mix of local people and migrant people migrants within the workplace. Alternatives to the current system were almost never really discussed or envisaged, and so they were the silences really. And I think the silences are really important if one considers where the UK government's trying to push employers at the moment in relation to horticultural work. So the long-term vision for horticulture is it's been summarised here in a EFRA Environment, Food and Rural Affairs Committee report in 2022, and it says here, in the longer term we agree with the government that the sector needs to shift its focus away from immigration and towards domestic workers and technological innovation and development. Well, I'd argue if that's the case, then there needs to be more of an engagement with the sciences that have characterised employer research to date. There needs to be engagement with those, particularly the last one about alternative food production systems, and perhaps the first one in terms of the distance between capital and labour in horticultural employment. So that's been some. You got 2 for 1, and I probably went through it a bit too quickly. But methodological reflections on the nature of employer research, and then some reflections on what impression management actually looks like in practice. In terms of conclusions, I think I would say this, but employers' constructions of the world and their representation of that to us as researchers are really worth studying. It's a vital piece of the migration jigsaw, given how important labour migration is within the overall scheme of international migration. But we need to think in terms of reflecting on those accounts. We need to think of the way in which certain information is presented to us as a front of stage performance and designed to impression manage. And it's not appropriate really to talk about getting false information, lies, or precarious information and precarious evidence. It's about the fact that there are different ways of viewing the world, and there are different ways of seeing the world, and employers presenting us with a particular insight, which is incredibly valid, but it also needs to be reflected on and critiqued. I'd say employer research and elite interviews are particularly dramaturgical, but also that we're all involved in some form of front of stage performance, and so I'll end with a bit of Shakespeare, that all the world's a stage, and front of stage performances are important for all kinds of research, but particularly important for the employer perspective. So I hope I've more or less kept to 45-50 minutes, and hopefully there's some questions. As I said, this is very much a kind of work in progress at the moment. It's a paper two papers that Sarah and I would like to work on and develop over the coming months. So questions and comments would be really welcome. So thank you.